At first, she could barely do his laundry without him asking her what she wanted for it. "Ah, Jesus," he said, sinking back into the chair. None of us ever thought about what would happen." "I know," she said. "I think Mark knows too. And Sandy. But it's still a problem sometimes." Roberts took a breath and then tried to set his face in steely determination. "You need to call her back. Please. Call Sandy and tell her I think that little girl working for Barbara may be in real danger." Clarice's eyes widened. "Then why don't you call the police?" "And tell them what?" "Tell them my wife's hiring maids that look like her daughter-in-law, or like you. They'll laugh at me." "Then why don't you just go back there and stay?" He shook his head. "Because I need someone else there with me. Someone who won't tell anyone else either. My friends are friends. They're not like normal friends. They'll sell me out in a heartbeat if they think there's something in it for him. Mark's the only one I've got. But he hates her. He'll never go back just to help her. Then he has to go back to make sure nothing happens to this poor girl living there now." Clarice just stared at him, her mind working through his logic. Then, without another word, she went back into the kitchen and phoned Sandy again. Returning a few moments later, she said, 7 o'clock. "Sandy can't promise he'll see you. Says he may slam the door in your face. But she says to be there at 7, and she'll try to prepare him for seeing you." Roberts's chin went to his chest as he said a silent prayer for the first time since Mark had disappeared. "Please, God, let him see me." Sandy was pensive when Mark walked in the door at 6:10. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and her eyes seemed skittish and afraid to look him in the face. "What is it?" he said, his body tensing. "Your dad wants to see you." "Is that all?" he said, tossing his briefcase on the chair beside the door and walking past her toward the bedroom to change. He called back over his shoulder as he neared the bedroom. "Tell him the answer's no." A moment later, she stood in the doorway, her eyes on the floor, and said, "I think you need to see him, Mark." He took a deep breath, then turned his back to her and reached into the closet for a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. "I don't need this now," he thought. "Just when everything's getting better. Just when we're almost back to normal. I just don't." "He says a girl may be in danger," Sandy said, still from the doorway, her voice still soft and afraid of him. "A girl your mom's got working there as a live-in maid." Mark snorted. "Anyone living within 50 miles of that which is in danger, Sandy. Everyone. She's toxic." He turned and saw tears on Sandy's face, and his whole mood softened. He walked to her and took her in his arms. "These people aren't our problem anymore, babe. They're just not. Okay?" "I'm sorry, Mark," she said. "Really, He lifted her chin with his fingertips and kissed her, her lips wet and salty with her tears. Seeing the hesitation and fear in her eyes, he softened completely. "Say it." She shook her head, and he pulled her into a hug and whispered into her ear. "I won't be mad, Sandy. Really, I won't. We need to get past this. Both of us." She pulled him tighter, but still said nothing. Stroking her hair and holding her there, he waited for her to settle down. Just as her muscles were almost totally relaxed, she spoke in a voice so small that Mark didn't hear her at first. When he made out what she said, he was dizzy. "The girl," Sandy said. "Your mom's hiring girls to live with her that look just like me and Clarice." When his mind processed this, he broke the hug and held Sandy by the shoulders, then looked at the fear written all over her face and her glistening, pleading eyes. The three of them sat around the tiny kitchen table, Mark opposite him and Sandy to his left. The anger and disgust was still on Mark's face all these months later, just as it had been the first time he'd confronted David and Barbara with his knowledge of their cheating. Taking a breath, David said, "I know I've said it before." "Good," Mark snapped. "Then don't waste my time saying it again. Just tell me what you know, how you know it, and what you think I can do about it." Roberts hesitated, looking from his son to Sandy, then back again. "Fair enough," he said. He spent the next 15 minutes bringing Mark up to speed on everything that had happened since last they'd spoken 11 months before. "That's it," Mark said when he finished. His face was a mixture of thought, revulsion, and curiosity. Roberts shook his head. "I've spent the afternoon tracking down one of the girls. One of them is placed somewhere else, Still working for the same agency that's gotten us these other two. A Belinda Wasserstein. When I tried to call her, she screamed at me and hung up. Won't take any calls now. And he laughed and then continued, maybe Mom was just a witch to her. God knows I couldn't work for her. She's driven away the help for years. Now you're making it out to be something sinister. There was fear there, Mark. I know fear when I hear it, and that girl was afraid. Mark's face said he didn't believe it, but he was unsure, too. He walked to the counter, retrieved a cell phone, handed it to Sandy, and said to Roberts, give her the number. Sandy, you call her and see what you can find out. Start right off by telling her someone may be in danger. Get her to talk to you so we can straighten this mess out, and you and I can get on with our lives. Sandy nodded at him, uncertainty all over her face. Roberts pulled out his cell phone and read Sandy the number, which she dutifully punched in. Roberts watched as her eyes shot to Mark, seeking some kind of answer. He nodded, and she took a deep breath before pressing talk. A moment later, her voice even and kind, Sandy said, Miss Wasserstein, whatever you do, don't hang up. I think a young girl's life may be in danger. Sandy's lips pressed together, waiting for a response. After what seemed hours, but was probably only 10 seconds or so, Roberts heard a tiny voice on the other end speak. Sandy's whole body relaxed in relief as she continued. My name's Sandy Roberts. Barbara Roberts is my mother-in-law, and we're worried she's hutting girls like you. We need you to tell us what happened while you worked for her. Can you do that? After another agonizing wait, the voice spoke, and Sandy said, Can I put you on speakerphone so my husband can hear you? My husband and Senator Roberts, Belinda. Can I do that? Almost immediately, Sandy smiled, pressed another button on the cell phone, and placed it in the middle of the table. All three of them hunched in close and Sandy said, Can you hear me okay? Yes, the voice said, tiny and far away. I can hear y'all fine. Belinda, can you just tell us what happened while you worked for Mrs. Roberts? Why you left? I don't know. It was. I just don't know, really. Don't be afraid, Sandy said. David was amazed watching her. Her voice was so soothing, but her body was a taut bundle of frayed nerves, her left hand spastically twitching. Even if it's weird or strange, or you don't think we'll believe you, you still need to tell us. There's another girl working there now, and we think she may be in danger. The dreams, Belinda started and then regrouped. It started with the underwear, I guess. The underwear? Some man, Charlie, I think his name was, he brought underwear over the third or fourth day I was there. It was. I don't wear that type of underwear. It's not proper. So why did he bring it? I think because Mrs. Roberts told him to bring it. Told me I had to wear it. I had to throw away what I had. It was all fine. Nothing wrong with it. She told me it had to go and I had to wear this. Did she say why? I don't really remember. Something like I was working for her now, and I had to dress appropriately. She paused, giving word to Roberts's thoughts. I mean, what does my underwear have to do with cleaning and such? I don't know, Belinda, Sandy said. What else happened? Like I said, she answered, her voice getting smaller. It was them dreams. What type of dreams? I can't. Can you go back to just me and you again? Sandy snapped up the phone, hit a button, and stepped away from the table. It's just us, she said, walking toward the living room. Can you tell the difference? Good. Yeah, you can just tell me. No, don't be. Of course, dear. Sandy disappeared down the hallway, and Roberts turned to look at his son. Mark's face was now full of pensive thought, his chin in his hands as he stared at the wall and waited for Sandy to return. Roberts almost reached across the table to comfort him, but Mark was shut in on himself. Frozen. Rigid. Roberts sat back in the chair and stared at the clock, trying to force time to pass before his fears drove him insane. Though it seemed like hours, the clock told him it had been only 14 minutes when Sandy stepped back into the dining room, the cell phone in the hand hanging limp at her side. Mark turned to face her and said, Well? She walked to the table and slid into the chair, her face looking shell-shocked. She was only there for 2 weeks. The dreams. She started having them on the second or third night there, and they got progressively worse. What type of dreams? Mark said, his voice soft and face full of concern for Sandy. She said they started out slowly. Vivid dreams full of gentle caresses. What type of caresses? Touching and sexual caresses. On her jugs, at first. Then, she looked at Roberts, then to her husband. Mark gave her a gentle smile and said, "Go ahead." They were down there, weren't they? Between her legs? Sandy nodded before continuing. She said the dreams got more vivid every night. And more was done to her. More, Roberts said, not recognizing his own voice. Sandy looked down at the table, her voice barely audible. Toward the end, she'd wake up and touch herself down there. Look at herself in the mirror. She'd be puffy. Not so's you'd know for sure something had been in her. She thought she was just having racy dreams, you know? Like real good dreams, so vivid, so alive. Dreams of past lovers she was experiencing again. "What happened?" Mark said, reaching out and putting his hand on hers. She snatched her hand away from his touch, though, and looked at him in fury. Mark froze. She was swollen and bruised the last morning when she woke up, she hissed at him. The morning she ran away and never went back. She woke up and she was aching and sore. And she was torn and bleeding. Roberts was stunned by her reaction, but a look at Mark caused a wave of agony to wash over the senator's body. Mark looked aghast and ready to cry, and ashamed. Sandy gave a tiny yelp, her hand going to her face to cover her mouth, and she ran off and disappeared toward the bedroom. Mark just slumped. Amanda was having the dream again. Only this time it was so much more. Clint was eager and hungry, licking her in ways she'd forgotten about. "This is so much better," he said at one point, leaning up and looking down the length of her body. She could still only see the gleaming whites of his teeth and the shoulders of that maroon and white jacket. "I've missed this, baby," she said to him. Her words were slow and sluggish, as if in slow motion. All of this was as if in slow motion, including the insatiable hunger building deep within her as he slowly pressed a finger into her. "You always liked this," he said, his finger beginning to wiggle inside of her. "You know I did," she agreed. "You've missed it. I never thought I'd feel this again, honey." "You can feel it forever now," he promised, his lips lowering back to her naked mound. His tongue was like red-hot fire as it flickered and danced, his finger impossibly big and long as it drove her to release. "Please," she pleaded as the sensations built. "Please say you'll never leave me again." She was on her side, so far on the edge of the bed Mark was afraid she'd fall if he touched her. She was awake, too. Just as he'd been much of the night, he knew that she, too, was wide awake. "I've got to go back down there," he said. "I don't know what I can do, but I think I have to go." She was still, and he was about to say more when she turned to face him. "I didn't mean to react like that, Mark. I don't want you to do it because you think I—" He placed his fingertip on her lips. "That's not why I'm doing it. I still hate myself forever." I was. They stared at each other for a moment, and then her face softened. "We need to just keep putting all that behind us, dear. Not forget, but learn to start living with it better. I thought we were doing pretty good." She reached over and stroked the stubble on his face. "We are doing pretty good. Real good. And we'll keep getting better. I was just so ashamed all over again. Forever hurting you like that." "I know," she said. She reached under the covers. He knew she was stroking her pregnant belly. The content smile on her face told him she was feeling for the baby. It was a long time ago, back when things were still new. Still too raw, I guess. He started to say something, but it was her turn to silence him with her gentle touch to his lips. "Both of us knew it wouldn't be easy, and it really hasn't been, okay? Just hearing that girl hearing what she went through that made it all come back to me, okay? I didn't do it to throw it back in your face. Really, I didn't. The way she said it. I knew what she'd been through, and I kinda went through a little bit of it all over again." "I'm sorry," he said, trying to make her see how much he meant it. She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I don't want you to be sorry anymore, Mark. Not about anything. Or us, either. We've both been sorry enough, and I think maybe that's why we need to remember and learn. Not dwell on it all and beat ourselves up, okay? Remember and learn," he repeated, stroking her naked shoulder. I love you. He leaned in to hug her, feeling the heat from her protruding belly pushing into him. I love you too. She stroked his hair, and he sighed into her bare flesh. Remember and learn, he kept saying to himself. There was no greeting when David Roberts picked up the phone. 3 o'clock, Mark said, his voice firm. Outside the law school at 3 o'clock. You pick me up? Are we? He started, letting it linger. We're gonna go back down to Tennessee and deal with this once and for all, Mark said. He hung up the phone before Roberts could respond. Roberts sprawled back on the hotel room bed and stared at the ceiling. His fears that Mark would turn him down were now replaced with fears of what they'd find once they got there, and how they'd deal with it. Amanda kept replaying the dreams in her mind as she went about vacuuming and sweeping. Her body was loose and languid, relaxed with a satisfying glow she'd not felt since Clint had gone off. Someone seems cheery this morning, Barbara said from behind her. Amanda froze, wondering again if the woman could read her mind. She turned and said, May I do something for you, ma'am? Her smile was puzzling, made all the more confusing as the woman's eyes traveled up and down her body. Are you wearing what was bought for you? Amanda felt the shame burn her face. She had to force herself to look at the imperious woman when she said, Yes, ma'am. Barbara's smile got brighter, almost realistic even. Good. With that, she turned and left the room. Later, as she washed the dishes from lunch, she thought she could hear voices speaking in the dining room. She shivered, unable to make out the words or clearly hear the voices, but sure that she and her employer were alone in the house. Must be the television, she told herself, knowing full well there was no television set within 40 feet of the dining room. This is way ahead of schedule, he said, his smile broad and genuine, the dimples in his cheeks deep and adorable. How so, dear? She wants it, he said, leaning back in the chair and putting his feet on the table. She gave him a disapproving stare, but he ignored her. She's not like the other ones. She was begging for more. Begging for it, Mama. But you didn't go too fast with her, did you? He chuckled. Not possible. I'm telling you, she ain't had none in years. She's just aching for it. Both nights, telling me to just keep right on at it. But she still thinks you're him, right? This Clint fellow of hers? For now, he said, his smile turning to a leer. For now she does. You've got to take it slowly, she said. Make sure she yearns for it every night. Anger flashed across his face, and he took on the look of a petulant child. I know what I'm doing here. I'm just saying, she started, but he cut her off. Well, don't. I'll set the timetable this go around. You set them last time, and look what happened. She wanted to disagree with him, but knew it would be useless. Nothing was ever his fault. Nothing had ever been his fault since he was a little boy. She'd never been able to say no to him, and deep inside she knew she'd been responsible for the way it had all turned out. What are you thinking? He asked. That you're so much like the rest of them, she said. The rest of who? He laughed. Daddy? Mark. She chuckled along with him at the absurdity of it. Mark? You've got to be kidding me. He's weak. No, dear. The politicians. The kingmakers. The rulers. How's that? He said, tilting the chair forward and leaning so close she just wanted to reach out and touch him. But she couldn't. She knew that now. She tried before, but her hands had only passed right through, which caused her to shrink back in the remembrance that he was dead now. You gonna answer me? He prodded, jolting her from her thoughts. You take what you want, Stevie. You always did. And that's what men like that's what powerful men do. They take what they want because they're not governed by the same rules. They bend the rules to suit their own needs, their own tastes and desires. He liked that answer. She could see his face pondering her answer and working through the permutations. My own tastes and desires, he said after a moment, perking up in glee. That's right, Mama. I'm making the rules now, and I need to just keep focused on my own tastes and desires. For a flickering moment, Barbara was taken aback and again afraid for the poor girl living across the hallway from Stevie. If only she knew what lay behind that door she was forbidden to enter. Then she looked back at Stevie and those thoughts and fears were banished. She'd missed him so much. She couldn't bear to again have him taken away. She only hoped he was right. She only hoped this was the one girl that would stay with him forever. The girl that would be with him forever. The girl that would visit her when he did so she could know he was happy wherever he was when he wasn't by her side. David Roberts picked up his son at 3 on the button. Actually, he'd been waiting down the street, illegally double parked for almost 15 minutes. He only nosed the car forward at 1 minute to 3 when Mark walked out the front doors amidst a throng of students and placed a duffel bag on the curb. He didn't bother looking around for Roberts, and when Roberts pulled to the curb seconds later, without any recognition, he walked around the passenger side, tossed the duffel bag in, threw his jacket in the back seat, and slid in, staring straight forward. "Let's go," he said. They were the last words he'd speak for almost 2 hours. Roberts was afraid to say anything for fear Mark would back out. Instead, he concentrated on getting them out of Chicago and Gary and getting them to Indianapolis in one piece. The traffic was horrendous this Friday night, and he was glad to have that to concentrate on. An hour north of Indianapolis, Mark spoke for the first time. "No sit-down dinner." "What?" "Just go to a drive-thru. We can switch over there." "I can drive for a while longer," Roberts said. "We'll switch over there," Mark repeated. His head turned to watch the passing scenery. "Okay," Roberts agreed, biting his tongue. Mark surprised him a moment later when, in a soft, even voice, he said, "You really have no idea what you people have done to us." "To me. I am sorry. Really, Mark, I can't begin to tell." "Sorry doesn't cut it, Dad." He wasn't angry. His tone was sad and worn out. "You used to mock me, probably still do, but you said I was naive. A Boy Scout. But you know what?" Roberts could feel his son's eyes now on him, and he said, "What?" "I never saw it that way. I saw it as giving people the benefit of the doubt. I believe people were good, Dad. That they basically wanted to do good and that they wouldn't screw you. I knew it was wrong. I always knew there were people out there who would screw me over without a second thought. But you know what? I didn't care," Mark continued as if talking to himself. "I never cared if someone screwed me over because, well, if they weren't family or a really close friend, how bad could they really screw me over? A couple of bucks? So what? Take it." "And now it was family," Roberts concluded. "And it was more than a couple of bucks, Dad. Way more. It was everything." "I know." "Last night," Mark said, turning back to the window and pausing, gathering himself. "Last time you saw us together back then, almost a year ago, you probably saw me and Sandy happy again and figured at least everything would be fine now." "Yeah," Roberts admitted. "I was at least relieved about that. We were all a bit quick to jump to that conclusion. It wasn't fine. Maybe a month later, it all started. Sandy wanted a nicer place, but I didn't want to move. I was comfortable, and I just wanted to relax for a while. You know, just keep settling down. Then I got to thinking she was manipulating me again. Anything she did, it was to get me to go along with her, Dad. You know what's so bad about that? Do you? You'd never thought about her manipulating you before." Mark laughed. "Give me a break. Everyone manipulates everyone else, Sandy included. Me included, for that matter. But before, when I really thought ours was the fairy tale romance, I never gave a shit. If she wanted it and it wasn't a big deal, or if I thought it would really make her happy, I just went ahead and did it. Made me feel better knowing I could make her happy. No, Dad. What's so bad about it was now I just saw it as evil. I saw it as my wife going back to manipulating me to get what she wanted. Instead of saying, sure, no big deal. We really could use a nicer place. I told her to go to hell. In those exact words. If she didn't like it, she could leave. Must have been difficult. Yeah, difficult. Try impossible. She just nodded and dropped it. But when she'd do something, hell, if she made my dinner, I thought she was trying to butter me up again. Trying to get me back to getting her a new place. A nicer place I knew we both wanted and could easily afford. But it didn't matter, because she was the only one that wanted it at the time, and I didn't want to back down. Pretty shitty thing to do. Now you're getting it, he said, his voice rising for the first time. It was an incredibly shitty thing to do. I became something I'd never been before. A complete, total, class, a scumsucker. Just like you and Mom always wanted. I never. Yes, you did. And when I wasn't, you took it for weakness. Roberts frantically tried to steer the conversation back to civility. How did you get past it? I hurt her, that's how. Just like she described last night happening to that maid? That's what I did. My anger was so all-consuming that one night when she came to me too. His voice cracked, and he struggled to regain his composure. Robert said nothing, waiting for Mark to settle down. When Mark spoke again, his voice was husky. I figured if she's going to use sex to manipulate me, I was damn sure going to make her pay a stiff price. And I hurt her. Robert sensed Mark wanted to talk this out now, to share this with someone other than Sandy, to somehow expiate his guilt at what he'd become. In a whisper, Robert said, "What happened after?" She was sobbing, wouldn't come near me, locked herself in the bathroom and stayed there, just crying for hours. And I sat on the bed wondering what the hell I'd become, wondering if maybe this wasn't just a huge mistake. And then I apologized, but she wouldn't look at me. She was afraid of me, cringing if I reached out to touch her, walking way around me if I was in the room. She stayed in the same bed, but she'd freeze up if I rolled over in the middle of the night and touched her, like she was afraid I'd hurt her again. Roberts felt the tears rolling down his cheeks, and the road was becoming blurry. He rubbed his eyes and tried to stop crying. He didn't want to trigger Mark's rage or run off the road. Mark didn't seem to notice, though. A couple weeks, maybe a month later, I sat down with her. I told her I'd get counseling, we'd get counseling, and we'd try to get back to where we were. She refused, told me she wasn't sure she wanted to stay anymore. She said I wasn't the Mark she'd fallen in love with. I'd become someone else, someone who was just angry all the time and paranoid and upset. And she was so sad and frightened when she said it, like she was at the end of her rope and was just ready to give up. Not an ounce of manipulation there, just pain. So what happened? I made an offer on the house she wanted, and that settled it? He laughed and shook his head. She refused to move there, said I'd always think she tricked me into it. Would you have? Is that what you thought? Yeah, probably. Then, at least I made the effort. I killed the contract right away, lost the earnest money, but she saw I was really trying again. I think that's why she didn't leave. After a while, after I fought really hard for a couple of months to just keep my anger in check, things started to settle down. We were touching again. You know, kissing, holding hands. It just got easier. And then she got pregnant, Robert said. No. And then I asked her if we were good enough to have a baby. She said no, we weren't. Mark cleared his throat, turning to his father. That was my last test, Dad. I don't think she knew it, but I tested her on having a baby. How so? If she'd said yes, I knew she'd be figuring that would tie me to her forever, give her the upper hand again. And when she said no, you knew she still wanted the marriage to really get back on track again, Roberts concluded. Exactly. Pretty shitty thing to do. Mark sighed. I know. If she gives in to what I knew had been her dream before, I hold it against her as somehow being a sign she's cheating me. How screwed up is that, huh? Can I say something? Yeah. I know what I said before, son. And I felt that way too. But I want you to know that I was wrong. Way wrong. I really like the old Mark a lot better. Yeah, he whispered, looking back out the window. Me too. Amanda was in her room, changing out of her uniform and into a pair of sweats and a t-shirt. She heard the click from the lock across the hallway. She heard Barbara slip into the room, closing the door behind her. There were whispers, then some chuckling. A moment later, she heard the door close, but no click as the lock was again set. Amanda, Barbara said, rapping on her door before stepping in. Yes, ma'am, Amanda said, jerking the sweatpants the rest of the way up. Her employer smiled at the glimpse of silk panties, then looked her in the eye and said, I'll be going shortly. Charles is taking me to dinner at the club. Yes, ma'am. You enjoy your free time, and I'll be back in time for us to have our tea. Amanda nodded, and Barbara slipped out the door, closing it behind her. 15 minutes later, she heard the front door close as the matron of the house left for dinner with a man not her husband. Slowly, her feet not making a sound, she slipped out her door and put her ear to the door across the hallway. Hearing nothing, she knocked on the door, standing back and ready to flee. There was no response. She knocked again and said, Hello, sir? Still, no response. Slowly, her hand trembling, She turned the brass doorknob, pushing the door open inch by inch, every muscle taut and ready to sprint back to the safety of her room. She got the door open enough to look inside. It was dark, and her hands slid over the wall, looking for the light switch. Finding it, she flipped it on and stepped back out of the doorway, praying no one was inside. Hearing no movement, she looked back inside the room again. It was a boy's room, that much was obvious. The bed was neatly made, the dresser topped with trophies from various sporting events, and posters of basketball and football players covered the walls. Stepping inside, she walked to the dresser, picking up a framed picture. It was a young man, tall and well-built. He was in a tuxedo, his hand holding that of a young, blonde woman dressed in a long, pale yellow dress. The boy's handsome was face topped by a mass of curly brown hair, his broad smile a touch lecherous and creating deep dimples in his cheeks. The giveaway was his eyes, though. He'd have been handsome, every girl's dream, if not for those eyes. They were sparkling and cruel, showing disdain and contempt. With a shudder, Amanda put the picture back down, being careful to place it in its exact spot. Turning to leave the room, she froze, her mouth agape. Terror swept through her torso to the ends of her limbs, and her eyes went wide and stayed there, staring at the jacket draped over the chair in the corner of the room. At the maroon jacket with white leather sleeves and white lettering. Stevie was embroidered across the left chest. It was a high school letterman's jacket. It was the jacket from her dreams. They stopped at a drive-through just south of Indianapolis. Roberts got a burger, fries, and a Diet Coke. Mark made do with fries and bottled water. He also took over the driving, and they started making better time. Dusk was turning the eastern sky black. Mark was glad for the lighter traffic. He set the cruise at 72 and just ate up the miles to home. To the place he swore time, and again he'd never again go. To the place where he was, even now, wondering why he was now headed. His father crumpled the half-eaten hamburger and pushed it back into the paper bag, placing it on the floor of the car. A couple of times, he started to say something, but he managed to choke back his statements. "What?" Mark finally demanded. "You want to say it? Now's the time to say it. You've got me captive for the next 4 hours, so you might as well say it." He sighed, girding himself for the backlash. "Does Sandy ever talk about her parents?" Mark said nothing for a moment, his eyes narrowing and focusing on the ribbon of interstate. "She misses her mom," he finally conceded. "She doesn't say anything, but I can tell. Not her dad so much. Hell, maybe not at all. But she misses her mom." "Has she called?" "Dunno. Don't think so, but I don't check up on her." "You think she's afraid to, though? Afraid you'll find out and get mad?" "Yeah, probably." "Have you told her it's okay?" "Is it?" Mark said, his knuckles turning white as he squeezed the steering wheel. "Is it okay to bring them all you included back into our lives?" His father was silent for a moment. "Her daddy's paid a pretty big price already, you know?" Mark snorted. "How's that? Last I checked, he was still governor. He had a real shot at the White House. Then why didn't he just go ahead and run?" "Because of Sandy's threat. At first, he couldn't announce because you'd run off. He didn't know why, none of us knew why, and he couldn't take the chance the press would find you and he'd be sunk or worse. After we all found you, though, and Sandy confronted him," he chuckled. "He was just plain screwed and tattooed. He knew for a fact the press would be camping on your doorsteps within days of announcing, and he'd still be sunk. Like to say I feel for him, but I don't. Not after what he did and why he did it. He's retiring when this term's up," Roberts continued. "Term limits. Then he'll go back to the State House." Roberts shook his head. "Can't go backwards or you're a goner." Was a time he'd have been a fine federal judge. Sixth Circuit was the talk, but he'll never get the appointment with a Democrat in the White House. By the time he's gone, no one will remember Pat. "Good," Mark insisted. "I just want you to think about something, Mark. Tell me to go to hell, that's fine. But think it over." Mark hesitated, his eyes on the road. After a moment, he willed himself to exhale and relax. "What?" he said. Not a question, just resignation. This new Mark? The one that's tearing you up inside? He'd tell Pat and Deborah to go to hell. But not the old Mark, son. Not the old Mark. He'd give him a second chance. So you saying I should give you and Mom a second chance too? I'd like to think so, at least for me. Your mom? She's not sorry, so I'm not sure how you should play that one. I'm not even sure how the old Mark would have played that one. He'd probably still have told her to go to hell. Mark chuckled, pondering it. The old Mark, or at least the dying remnants of what he used to be, had done just that. He'd told them all to go to hell, and he'd meant every last word of it. Now, after all of the strife and anguish of trying to rebuild his marriage, it seemed even more far-fetched to ask this of him. If you don't do it for them, his dad said after a moment, then do it for you and Sandy. Don't let us all what we did to you, don't let it keep all that hatred festering inside of you. If only for you and Sandy, don't give any of us the satisfaction, okay? Mark shot a glance at his father. He was looking down in his lap, too hang-dog to look his son in the eye. His father was now ashamed to ask his son to not become what he'd always wrongfully wanted him to become. But he was right, Mark thought. They'd all wanted to create Frankenstein's monster. They'd wanted Mark to become what he'd never been. Then, once he'd become that, they'd seen the price of getting their wish. They had, in fact, created a monster. Yet, Mark didn't like the monster he'd become, either. Couldn't someone just wave a goddamned magic wand and make all of this good again? Why was it falling on him again? Out of all of us, his father mumbled, as if reading Mark's mind, you're the only one strong enough, the only one good enough to make this right again. Mark said nothing in return. He drove on in silence, thinking. At 5 to 8, Barbara Roberts came to a sudden halt outside Amanda's room. Looking at Stevie's door, she saw that the lock was not set. She thought back to a few hours before. Had she locked it when she left? She always did. Always. Granted, it wouldn't keep anyone out. They could unlock it just as easily as she could. Still, she'd always locked it. Ever since Stevie had been killed all those years before, she kept it locked off as her own private shrine to what could have been. She rapped on Amanda's door, trying to maintain her composure and not just walking right in like she usually did. After a few seconds, the door opened and Amanda poked her head out. Is it 8 already? She forced a smile in place and said, Yes, dear. The girl hesitated, fidgety, her eyes avoiding Barbara. Yes, she said. Barbara stood back and Amanda stepped out, her eyes turning to look at Stevie's door before shooting back straight down the hallway. While Amanda was in the kitchen brewing the tea, Barbara pondered how to play this. She knows, Mama, Stevie said, his displeasure evident. She went in there. Saw the jacket. I realized that, dear, Barbara said. So what are you gonna do about it? Barbara smiled. She'll be nervous, afraid, maybe even suspect what we're doing here, having our little tea times together and all. So how are you gonna get her to drink it? I'll pour the bourbon in plain sight is how. And the stuff? She turned the palm of her hand over and showed him the tiny capsule pinched in there. She'll never see it. I'll do it right in front of her, and she'll never see a thing. You think it'll, he started, then froze and turned at the sound of Amanda's footsteps drawing near. In a flash, he was gone. There you go, dear, Barbara said, walking toward her to take the tray away and toward the table with the brandy decanter. Amanda sat down in her usual chair, her eyes locked on Barbara. Barbara only smiled, still facing the girl as she poured the brandy into both cups in full view of her. Amanda's relief was evident, and Barbara just gave a broader smile as she wiped the powdery residue still clinging to her palm against the side of her dress. Barbara decided to go forward with business as usual. No tricks or blustering, no mention of Amanda's entry into the forbidden room. Just play it all out with a rundown of the next day's cleaning tasks. Once they'd both finished their first cup of tea, Barbara stood and said, I hope you don't mind, dear, but dinner has worn me out. Charles can be so energetic when he has a mind to be. I won't be taking a second cup this evening. Amanda stood, looking from her empty tea cup to Barbara's and back again. You're more than welcome to have another cup if you wish, Barbara continued. You do seem to have taken a fancy to it. Amanda's eyes showed gratitude. No, thank you, ma'am, she said, the trace of a smile on her lips. Good night then, Barbara said, walking past her and toward her bedroom. Good night, ma'am, the girl replied. Amanda never saw the smile of triumph on Barbara's face as she ascended the stairway. They were only 45 minutes out when Mark finally gave words to what had been troubling Roberts all day. "So how are we gonna play this?" "Confront her. Both of us. Just come straight out and insist she check into a hospital." Mark chuckled. "It's going to be 10:30 or later before we get there, you know? We do this in broad daylight after her afternoon nap with a couple of snifters of brandy down her gullet, and she's liable to tell us to go to hell. Wake her up in the middle of the night and just go after her? I mean, you're kidding, right? You have to know this is gonna fail. I've already got that taken care of." "How?" "I called that poor girl back," he said. "Belinda Wasserstein. She took my call, and I asked her to help. So long as I can keep her name out of the papers, she said she would." "So how does she help?" "Judge Tompkins will be staying up late tonight," Roberts said, turning to look at the clouds darkening the night sky and seeing a flash of lightning off in the distance. How had it come to this? He wondered. "You're going to have her involuntarily committed?" Mark asked with amazement in his voice. "Paperwork's already drafted. Fess Stewart's got it all written up and ready to go, and he's waiting for our phone call to get it over to Tompkins. Tompkins doesn't know about all of it, just knows it's a favor being called in from an old friend. If he knew, he'd probably already have the police there. She's gonna cut your nuts off, Dad. You know what you're doing here." He paused, his voice dropping even lower. "You'll never be able to keep this quiet. It'll come out." "Yeah," he admitted. "Still, Tompkins has already said he'd do everything in his powers to keep that girl's name out of the papers." "She'll sell her story," Mark said. "You may have to resign over this." "Already drafted," he said. "You're quitting?" "Uh-huh. Why?" He thought about it for a moment, then said, "I'm not really sure when it happened, Mark. Believe it or not, I used to be just like you. That's why we were always so much closer back then, at least as close as my schedule allowed. Not really sure when it all changed, tell you the truth. Or why. It just did, I guess. Gradually, before I even knew it." He went silent, thinking about it. "Go on," Mark urged after a moment. "A couple of days ago, Cameron from Pennsylvania asked if I was going to be stepping down early. They all knew I wasn't gonna run again. But now they wanted to know if I was gonna just step aside in time for them to take advantage and make sure they kept the seat." "You weren't going to run again?" Roberts ignored him, lost in his own thoughts. "I told him I'd let them know, then try to figure out how to take advantage of it. Know what I mean? Right up to the very end, I was trying to take advantage, exert the maximum influence. Then I came back here. I talked with Clarice, saw you and Sandy. What's that got to do with?" "I lay in bed all last night, just staring at that ceiling. And I thought back on what I'd just seen and heard, and it just came to me. Came to me like it still hadn't before, not even last year when it all went bad with you. It was that little extra bit of influence I was looking for back then. Both with you and with Clarice and Sandy and Stevie and all of it. Just that little bit more." Mark stayed silent now, just driving on and keeping his eyes on the road. Roberts drew a breath, exhaled, and said, "I went into all of this to do good. Not by me, but for everyone. I'm not sure when that changed, but it did. Sure, your mom had a lot to do with it, but I'm still a man, you know? I'm responsible for my own goddamned actions. And looking back on it all, at least the last 10 or 12 years of it, well, I just didn't like what I was seeing, what I'd become." He turned and looked at Mark. "I'm doing this to help some poor little girl I've never met, and to make sure there are no other little girls like her. I'm doing this to get help for the woman I once loved so much it hurt, regardless of what she's become or why she ever did any of it. I'm doing it because, like you once told me, it's the right thing to do, and that's just gonna have to be good enough." He could hear the sad humor in Mark's voice. "You're a Boy Scout. Guilty as charged." 15 minutes out, the clouds broke and cleared away, and they saw the moon up ahead. "Jesus," Mark said, his eyes going from the road to the big full moon. It was enormous and orange, a harvest moon. But unlike all of the harvest moons of his childhood, Roberts saw that this one was streaked with splashes of burnt red, and this one was hanging in the direction of their house, as if suspended there to guide them the rest of the way home. "Appropriate, wouldn't you say?" Mark said, his voice filled with wonder. "How so?" Robert said, his eyes fixed. "It's Halloween, Dad. You didn't know?" He said nothing in response. He just stared at the blood-orange moon leading them home. Amanda tried to stay awake, but she couldn't. She felt it weighing her down, collapsing her eyelids as she fought to keep them open. When had she done it? Amanda had watched her the whole time. She'd have never drunk that tea if she'd have seen anything even remotely out of the ordinary. But she knew. Amanda knew she'd been drugged, and she knew that the boy in the room across the hallway would be calling on her again. She was helpless and terrified, wishing she could will her legs to respond and take her away from here before she succumbed to the darkness. Amidst her horror, it all went black. "You there, Fess?" Mark heard his dad say into the cell phone. "And it's all set up? Good. Do me a favor, give Sheriff Farley a call, will ya?" "No, don't tell him anything yet, but give him a heads up to have someone waiting." "No, I don't really know what you should say, but I'm sure you'll figure out something." He hung up as Mark pulled up to the guard shack and came to a stop, rolling down the window. "That you, Mark Roberts?" "Yeah, Jimbo. It's me," he said, trying to smile and look at the old man leaning out the window. He couldn't, though. His eyes were locked on their big stone house at the top of the hill, that sinister disk blowing in the sky above it. He shuddered. "You okay?" the guard said. He finally turned to the guard and managed a weak smile. "We're just dropping by to see Mom." His father leaned across the front seat and said, "Hey, Jim, is she in?" "Evening, Senator." "Yeah, she's up there. Got back about 8. "She alone?" "Just her and the housekeeper." Robert sat back, looking at his son, then at the house. His lips were tight, and his face was a tense mask of fear and anticipation. Then, as Mark's eyes followed the gate as it lifted, he saw what his father was looking at. The house was dark save one room. Stevie's room was ablaze with light. He hit the gas and sped up the hill. He was back again, and this time Amanda was scared. She could see the maroon jacket and the hat, but she could see the face, too. It wasn't Clint. She couldn't make out the features. They kept moving and blurring in and out, but it definitely wasn't Clint. "Does this feel good?" he said, brushing the back of his knuckles over her t-shirt. "Please don't," she mumbled. "You're not him. You're not Clint." "Of course I'm not, honey," he said, finding humor in her realization. "But you said you were," she tried to argue, willing her limbs to move. "I know. What can I say?" Her limbs were leaden, just splayed out where he'd placed them. She concentrated as hard as she could, trying to just twitch her fingers to see if she could get them to respond. "There's nothing you can do," he taunted. "Nothing, you hear?" "But I don't want this," she said, feeling the tears well up and blind her vision even further. "They all say that," he snapped, getting angry. "All of them. And they're all just like you. They're lying little skanks. You wanted it sure enough last night, though, didn't you? And the night before, too. You were begging me to lick that precious little kitty of yours. But you know what?" "What?" she said. "Now it's my turn. Now you get to take care of me for a change." "Please," she pleaded, hearing it come out in slow motion. He stood above her, and she saw it. She saw his excitement bobbing out in front of him, enormous and grotesque. She knew he'd rip her apart, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. They both bolted from the car and sprinted to the front door. Roberts fumbled with his keys, finally finding the right one and opening it. "Where?" Mark asked, looking around the darkened rooms. "You check my bedroom. I'll check Stevie's." Mark was halfway up the stairs before Roberts had finished speaking. Roberts chased up after him, turning right down the long hallway just as Mark threw open his bedroom door to the left and flipped on the light switch. "She's not here," he hissed. Roberts kept going, stopping outside Stevie's door while Mark was still 20 feet behind him. Steeling himself with a breath, Roberts unlocked the door and pushed it open, rushing inside. But it was empty. Turning back and almost running into Mark, he wondered where the girl could be. That's when they heard the scream. Her eyes never left the bouncing phallus as it drew nearer and nearer to her spread legs. The whole time, she kept reserving her energy and focusing her mind, hoping against hope that she'd be able to at least get someone's attention. A neighbor, the guard, anyone. Then she felt it, the cold, spongy tip pressing against her. Too bad you didn't want it, he leered. I'd have taken the time to get you ready. As it is, you'd better just hope you adjust before I rip it all up down there. With a final breath, she bit her lip. Then, just as he gave her one final vicious smile, she opened her mouth and screamed for all she was worth. And to her amazement, the sound came out. Mark didn't even hesitate. He lowered his shoulder and charged the door, splintering the doorknob and flinging the door backward. His father was right behind him, flipping on the switch. When Mark looked up, though, he froze. Disbelief masked his face. It was Stevie, alive again. And then it wasn't. How dare you? Barbara thundered, her head turning to look at him. She was hovering above the prostrate form lying spread eagle on the bed, dressed in Stevie's old high school letterman's jacket, his baseball cap on her head. The girl's eyes were filled with terror, her face pleading with Roberts to save her. Between them, hovering from a harness strapped around Barbara's waist, was an enormous dildo. Before he could move or respond, Mark screamed at her from behind him. Get the hell off of her. Now, get the hell off her, you 304. Then he was around Roberts and standing beside the bed, pushing Barbara onto the floor before sweeping the girl up in his arms and turning back to Roberts. I'm calling the police, Mark said, his face daring Roberts to challenge the decision. Roberts just nodded, his eyes falling on the girl in Mark's arms. He reached out and brushed a tear off her cheek, but that just brought a flood of new tears. Tears of relief. Oh, how delightful, Barbara sneered at him. The two of you dropped by to save the day. He turned and watched as she clawed her way to a kneeling position, then pulled herself up to her feet. How could you? How could I what? You sniveling little shit. How could you do this to her? He asked, trying to find an answer. To them? Her face looked at him in a mask of contempt. Because Stevie wanted it, that's how. What? You think I like this? But Stevie's dead. It started with a smile, turned to laughter, and soon she was hysterical. Tears and laughter and anguish all mixed with one. He came back to me, she kept saying. He did. He came back and asked me to do this, or he'd leave again. Don't you see? But try as he might, Roberts didn't see. He could only watch as this woman who had once been his wife suffered a complete meltdown in front of him. Naked save for a hat, a jacket, and that weapon bobbing obscenely in contrapuntal movement to her own. She's gone, he realized. Completely, totally gone. Replaced by this sybaritic nightmare now shrieking before him. They all stood outside the room, the doctor's voice both sympathetic at their plight while also eager about his new subject. It's way too early, you understand, he said. Mark nodded, but his father only stared at the floor and waited. From what you've told us and from what we've observed for the past 14 hours or so, it's pretty clear that the death of your son was the start of it all. She couldn't cope with it, so she brought him back. But this, the deputy behind him said, how'd you explain this? Stevie died shortly after assaulting a young woman, the doctor explained to him. Really? He said, eyes wide. Then he shot an embarrassed look at Senator Roberts before looking down and mumbling. So what's that have to do with this? She convinced herself that that's what he wanted, what he was like. So, thinking she had to give him what he wanted, she brought the girls in and reenacted that night. The night he died. I still don't get it, the deputy complained. It may have been the only way she could cope with what he'd done, the doctor explained. By reenacting that last night, she came to accept what no woman would otherwise accept, even in their own son. She provided her own answers for why he did it by telling herself that it wasn't really non-consensual, that they liked it. But they didn't. They kept running off. He shook his head. She overlooked that, thinking it was something else in the seduction that went wrong. Don't call it that, Mark finally snapped. This wasn't a seduction. It was an assault. She assaulted all those poor women, and you're trying to explain it away like it's just some stupid coping mechanism. The doctor gave a patronizing smile, but the deputy seemed to agree with him. Objectively, what she did was wrong, the doctor said. Of course it was wrong. But subjectively in her own mind, this was what she needed to cope with the trauma of your brother's death and what he did that night. Wrong, his father said, looking up and looking Mark straight in the eyes. She did it because she thought it would keep Stevie with her. She didn't do it to explain his actions away or to somehow make them better. She did it to keep him here for her own goddamned, selfish reasons. That's why she did it, and it was wrong no matter how loony you say she is. The doctor pursed his lips, but Roberts just walked away. After a moment, Mark turned to follow him. When he caught up to his father near a vending machine, he said, "It's not your fault. Some of it is. No one could have seen this coming. Not this." He looked at Mark, sipping his coffee. "You know what? What? You had it right. Back there in that room, you hit the nail right on the head. How's that?" He smiled. "She's a 304. Always has been, always will be." Mark smiled in return and said, "Yeah, I guess you know." "Only too well," he replied, turning to walk down the hall. "Let's get the hell out of here. Get us some breakfast." "You buyin'? S'pose it's the least I can do." "Then I'm in." When they got out of the car in his driveway, the door flew open. Sandy ran to him, her face full of fear and anticipation and happiness and just about every other emotion under the sun. She threw herself into his arms, nearly knocking him over. "Whoa up there, girlie," he said, pulling her in tight. "Jesus, we just spoke a couple hours ago." "I'm so sorry," she said. "I am." And just like that, she let it all go. "You've been taking care of my little baby girl here?" he whispered in her ear while stroking her swollen belly. "Yeah," she sniffled, not letting him go. "Good. Let's all go into the house." She leaned back, looking at Mark before looking at his father. "All of us," Mark said, answering her unspoken question. Senator Roberts gave a tired smile before trudging to the door. Once they were all settled inside, Mark and his father took turns telling the whole sad story, from beginning to end. When they were finished, Sandy reached her hand across the love seat and squeezed Mark's hand. "You saved her. Both of you. If you hadn't gone down there." She just let it linger. Mark said nothing, preferring to sip his bourbon and thank God he wouldn't have to live with the what-ifs. "The girl," Sandy said. "She's fine," Roberts answered. "She's with your folks." "My folks?" Roberts nodded. "They took her in after she got out of the hospital. Not as a maid. Least not yet. Just as a favor to an old friend. Your father personally went to the hospital and picked her up." Sandy smiled. Then her lips tightened, and she looked at Roberts. "You resigned. It was all over the news channels this afternoon." He nodded. "It's time." She couldn't think of what to say in response. After a moment, she turned to Mark, her face sad. "I want you to call your folks," Mark said. "Maybe make some plans to get together with them." A brief cloud of anger swept over her face, and Mark was sadly happy that she was still angry with them. The anger was soon replaced with hesitation, and that hesitant look robbed Mark of his momentary glee and made him feel ashamed of himself. "This is no trick," he said. "I'm not testing you, babe. Really, I'm not. As a matter of fact, I'm going to have to insist." Her eyes searched his face, trying to discern his motives. "It's been long enough," Mark said, looking over at his father as he continued speaking. "I like the Mark that I used to be way better than the Mark I am now. And the Mark I used to be, the one you really fell in love with, he needs to come back to stay." "But they'll interfere," she said, her voice low. He turned back to her and smiled. "Probably. But it'll be doting grandparent interference, not let's go out and ruin their lives interference." "But how do you know that?" "I don't. But we've both learned our lessons, right?" Her look was confused, and he explained. "Remember and learn, Sandy. That's what we agreed, right? Remember and learn. That doesn't mean hate and punish. At least not anymore, it doesn't." Her smile was of relief, and she leaned in and hugged him. "Maybe tomorrow," she whispered into his ear. "I've got other plans until then." Mark heard his dad stand. "I'll take this as my cue to leave." With a last gentle squeeze, Mark broke his hug with Sandy and stood. "Speak to you outside for a moment?" His dad's eyes narrowed, and he nodded. Once outside, his father leaned against the car while Mark looked at him. "What?" his dad prodded. "What did you see?" Mark said. The look on his father's face told Mark that he'd seen it too. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean. What did you see when we slammed into that room? Who was that above that poor woman?" His father's lips pressed together. With narrowed eyes, he said, "Your mother. In that costume. But that's not the face you saw when we first busted in there, was it?" Roberts's lips pressed together yet more. "Was it?" Mark said again. After a moment, his father shook his head. "I saw Stevie." Mark just nodded, relieved he wasn't the only one. Then he shuddered, and he said, "Me too." "Yeah," his dad said. "We need to tell them." "Tell them what?" "That there really is a ghost of my mad assaulter son?" He gave a bitter laugh. "They'll put us away right along with her, Mark. You want to spend the rest of your days in there, too? Like her?" Mark said nothing. He was right. Without another word, his father opened the car door and started it up. With a wave, he drove off. Mark watched him, his mind on that maniacal look his brother had given him the night before. "This is almost too good to be true," Stevie said. "I mean, you see all them nurses? Hell, there's gotta be a dozen of him that about perfect. But what can I do?" she pleaded with him. He turned and gave her a wide, lecherous smile. "I think I'll just take it from here on in." Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.